I hate this. I hate all of this, Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible above the clinking of glasses and the obnoxious laughter that echoed through the opulent ballroom. Her cheap, ill-fitting dress felt like a burlap sack against the silk and satin finery of the other guests. Each glittering chandelier seemed to mock her, reflecting 1,000 tiny spotlights on her singular, pathetic existence at the edge of the room. She sat alone at a small, round table, tucked away near the kitchen entrance, a forgotten shadow at a wedding that wasn't hers. A wedding she had no business even attending. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, a stark contrast to the faint smell of bleach and old coffee that clung to her own worn cardigan, discarded on the chair beside her. Her stomach grumbled, a low, embarrassing growl, but she dared not approach the lavish buffet, not after the way Mrs. Moretti, the bride's mother, had practically sneered at her when she arrived, a thinly veiled insult about unexpected guests hanging in the air. Amelia knew she was an obligation, a distant cousin of the groom's late mother, invited out of some misplaced sense of familial duty, or perhaps just to fill a vacant seat. She felt like an alien, a creature from another, far less privileged world, dropped into a scene of excessive wealth and effortless grace. Her gaze drifted across the room, past the gyrating dancers and the beaming bridal couple, settling on a small figure huddled beneath a grand piano, a child. A little boy, no older than 5, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed too large for his pale face. He was clutching a small, worn teddy bear, tears silently streaming down his cheeks, utterly ignored by the joyous chaos around him. A pang of raw, aching familiarity shot through Amelia's chest. She knew that kind of loneliness, that desolate feeling of being invisible in a crowd, of being utterly abandoned amidst celebration. It was a feeling she'd carried with her since she was a little girl, shuffled between disinterested relatives after her parents' deaths, a feeling that had only intensified with her recent struggles. A fresh wave of humiliation washed over her. Just last week, she'd been served another eviction notice. The small, dingy apartment, her only sanctuary, was slipping through her fingers. Her job at the diner barely covered rent, let alone the mountain of medical bills from her sister's last hospital stay. A burden she carried alone since Sarah's husband had walked out, leaving Amelia to pick up the pieces. Shame twisted in her gut, a knot of desperation she fought to swallow down. She shouldn't be here. She should be working, cleaning, doing anything but wallowing in self-pity while surrounded by people who had no concept of her daily fight for survival. But the boy, he looked so small, so utterly lost. Her heart, already so bruised and heavy, ached for him. She remembered nights spent under park benches, clutching her own tattered doll, wishing someone, anyone, would just see her. The memory was a sharp, cold jab. She couldn't just sit there, not while a child was hurting. Slowly, carefully, Amelia pushed back her chair. Each creak of the wood sounded like a cannon shot in the otherwise muffled hum of the room. She felt eyes on her, imagined whispers dissecting her every move. She walked, a silent prayer on her lips, towards the grand piano, her cheap heels clicking softly on the polished marble floor. The boy flinched as she approached, pulling his knees tighter to his chest. His little shoulders trembled. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice soft, gentle, a stark contrast to the harsh self-condemnation that usually filled her mind. She knelt down, ignoring the protest of her worn dress, bringing herself to his eye level. "What's wrong, sweetie? Are you okay?" He shook his head, burying his face deeper into the teddy bear. A security guard, a hulking man in a pristine black suit, sauntered past, glancing down at them with an expression of mild annoyance, before continuing his patrol. He didn't even pause. No one did. It was as if she and the child were invisible, two forgotten souls in a room full of vibrant life. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice laced with genuine concern. "Where's your mommy or daddy?" He finally looked up, his big, tear-filled eyes meeting hers. They were a startling shade of hazel, flecked with gold, even through the tears. I don't know," he mumbled, his voice tiny, barely audible. "They're busy," he sniffled, a fresh tear tracing a path down his cheek. "No one wants to play with me." A fresh wave of empathy washed over Amelia. She'd heard that before. You're too much trouble, Amelia. Go play by yourself. We're busy. The echoes of her own childhood neglect resonated deeply within her. She reached out a hesitant hand, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. His skin felt warm, fragile. Well, I want to play with you, she said, offering a small, tired smile. It was a genuine smile, the first one she'd truly felt all night. My name's Amelia. What's yours? Luca, he whispered, his voice gaining a touch of confidence. He eyed her warily, but there was a flicker of hope in his gaze. Luca, she repeated, trying to inject warmth into the name. That's a very nice name. Would you like to hear a story, Luca? I know a really good one about a brave knight and a grumpy dragon. His eyes widened slightly. A dragon? A very grumpy one, Amelia confirmed, lowering her voice conspiratorially. He hoarded all the chocolate in the kingdom, and only a very brave knight could get it back. She began to weave a tale, a simple, whimsical story, her voice soft and melodious. As she spoke, the child slowly uncurled, leaning closer, his tears forgotten. His small hand, almost unconsciously, reached out and gripped her finger, a tiny anchor in her sea of quiet despair. Minutes turned into what felt like an hour. The music swelled and receded, laughter erupted, and the clinking of glasses continued, but in their small hidden corner, a bubble of peace had formed. Luca was captivated, his earlier distress replaced by a tentative curiosity. He even managed a small watery smile when she described the knight accidentally tickling the grumpy dragon. Suddenly, a harsh, grating voice cut through their quiet sanctuary. Well, if it isn't the little charity case, still clinging to her delusions of grandeur. Amelia's heart lurched. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Marcus, her ex-fiancé. He stood over them, a sneer twisting his handsome face, flanked by a tall, glamorous woman in a shimmering gown. His eyes, once full of a love she'd foolishly believed in, now held only contempt. He hadn't changed. Not really. Still the same entitled bully he'd always been, just with more money and a shinier veneer. He'd broken her heart, shattered her trust, and then left her with nothing but a pile of debt and the lingering scent of his betrayal. Marcus, she said, her voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the warmth she'd shown Luca. She instinctively shielded the boy slightly with her body. Still playing the benevolent martyr, Amelia, he scoffed, taking a sip from his champagne flute. Always drawn to the weakest link, aren't you? First my pathetic, sickly sister, now some neglected brat at a wedding. Pitiful. He gestured dismissively at Luca, who instinctively recoiled, his hand tightening on Amelia's finger. The woman beside Marcus, a vision in emerald green, giggled. Oh Marcus, darling, don't be cruel. She's probably just trying to find a new sugar daddy. She always did have a knack for latching onto vulnerability. Her eyes raked over Amelia's modest dress with undisguised disdain, though I doubt even she could spin this into a sympathetic story. A cold flush crept up Amelia's neck. Her cheeks burned with shame. She felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped bare under their cruel gazes. Every harsh word was a physical blow. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into thin air. Her stomach churned, and a familiar metallic taste filled her mouth. The humiliation was a suffocating blanket, heavy and inescapable. She gripped Luca's hand tighter, a silent promise to protect him from their poison. He's just a child, Marcus, she managed, her voice trembling. Leave him alone. Leave us alone. Marcus laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. Oh, look at her, Miss Amelia, the fierce protector of the downtrodden. Still clinging to that pathetic idealism, even after everything. It's no wonder you're still broke, still alone. No one wants a bleeding heart, Amelia. They want winners. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. And you, my dear, are a spectacular loser. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, echoing the cruel pronouncements of her own past, the voices that had told her she was worthless, that she'd never amount to anything. Her vision blurred, tears pricking at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall, not in front of him, not in front of Luca. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Luca, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, started to whimper again, pressing himself closer to Amelia's side. He looked up at Marcus with wide, terrified eyes. "Now, Luca," Marcus said, suddenly changing his tone, a fake sweetness coating his words, though his eyes remained hard. "Run along, little one. Your parents must be looking for you. This woman is clearly distracting you." He tried to pry Luca's hand from Amelia's, his touch surprisingly rough. Luca cried out, pulling back, his small face contorted in fear. "No, I want to stay with Amelia." Marcus's fake smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. He reached again, this time more forcefully. "Don't be difficult, kid. Go on now." Amelia immediately moved, positioning herself fully between Marcus and Luca. "Stop it, Marcus," she snapped, a sudden surge of protective fury overriding her humiliation. "Leave him alone. You're scaring him." "Oh, you're going to tell me what to do now, are you?" Marcus sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just waltz in here, hijack someone else's kid, and play mother? You can barely take care of yourself, Amelia. You're one missed paycheck away from sleeping on the streets, remember?" He took another step forward, his imposing figure looming over her, his eyes radiating a chilling blend of anger and disdain. The woman beside him just watched, a smirk playing on her lips. The threat was palpable. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drum against her ribs. She was scared, more terrified than she had been in a long time, not just for herself, but for Luca. Marcus was unpredictable, especially when his ego was bruised. She could almost feel the phantom sting of his past cruelties, but she wouldn't back down, not when Luca was looking at her with such desperate trust. "I said leave him alone," she repeated, her voice rising, surprising even herself with its newfound strength. She glared at Marcus, her eyes, though brimming with unshed tears, blazing with defiance. Just as Marcus raised a hand, perhaps to push her aside, perhaps to do something far worse, a voice, deep and resonant, cut through the tension. It was calm, utterly devoid of emotion, yet it held an undeniable power that instantly commanded silence. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was like a sudden, unexpected chill in the heated air. It wasn't loud, but it resonated with an authority that made everyone, even Marcus, freeze. Amelia slowly turned her head, her breath catching in her throat. A man stood just a few feet away, seemingly having materialized out of the shadows. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, tailored to perfection, emphasizing a lean, powerful physique. His presence was formidable, radiating an aura of quiet danger. His face was chiseled, framed by dark, slicked-back hair, and his eyes were like chips of obsidian, sharp and intense, scanning the scene with unnerving stillness. He moved with a predatory grace, like a panther in the night, every muscle coiled, every movement deliberate. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without ever needing to raise his voice. He was terrifying, and undeniably, magnetically attractive. Marcus, for all his bluster, visibly paled. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a flicker of fear. He recognized this man. Everyone in this room, Amelia suddenly realized, recognized him. It was a recognition born of fear, of respect, of unspoken power. The man's gaze, unblinking, settled first on Luca, then on Amelia, then finally, cold and piercing, on Marcus. His eyes lingered on Marcus's still raised hand, then flicked to the terrified child cowering behind Amelia. A subtle tightening around his jaw was the only indication of his displeasure. "Luca," the man said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of question, a simple acknowledgement. Luca, who had been hiding behind Amelia's dress, slowly peeked out. His eyes, though still wide with residual fear, now held a glimmer of something else. Recognition, and a strange, tentative relief. "Papa," he whispered, a tiny, almost inaudible sound. Amelia's blood ran cold. "Papa!" This terrifying, powerful man was Luca's father? The realization hit her like a physical blow. The Mafia boss. The rumors, whispered and hushed tones about the elusive, ruthless head of the Rossi family, suddenly clicked into place. This was him. The man everyone feared. The man who controlled a vast, unseen empire. The boss, his gaze never leaving Marcus, simply extended a hand towards Luca. The gesture was slow, deliberate, yet held an implicit command. Luca, after a moment's hesitation, released Amelia's finger and walked towards his father, wrapping his small arms around the man's leg. The boss, in a rare, almost imperceptible gesture, gently placed a hand on Luca's head, a touch that seemed impossibly tender for such a fearsome man. Then, his eyes, still cold as ice, locked onto Marcus again. "You were threatening a child?" His voice was still calm, a dangerous calm that sent shivers down Amelia's spine. Marcus stammered, his usual arrogance completely gone. "No, Mr. Rossi. No, of course not. Just a misunderstanding. This woman here, she was bothering the boy. I just stepped in to help." He gestured wildly at Amelia, throwing her under the bus without a second thought. The woman beside him nodded vigorously, a terrified smile plastered on her face. The boss's gaze shifted to Amelia. It was a long, assessing look that made her feel as though he could see straight into her soul, peel back every layer of her humiliation and despair. She met his gaze, her chin trembling slightly, but refusing to drop. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice directed solely at her. Amelia took a shaky breath, summoning every ounce of courage she possessed. She wouldn't lie, not when she'd been trying to protect Luca. "No," she said, her voice clear despite the tremor. "He was alone, crying. No one paid him any attention. I was telling him a story." She glanced at Luca, who was now clinging to his father's leg, looking up at Amelia with something akin to admiration. "Your son was scared. Mr. Davies here was harassing us." The boss's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. He looked at Marcus, then at the woman beside him, then back at Amelia. A heavy silence descended upon their small group, broken only by the distant music of the wedding. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, sensing the shift in power, the sudden ominous presence that had materialized. "I see," the boss said, his voice dangerously soft. He looked down at Luca, who was still clutching his leg. "Did this woman hurt you, son?" Luca shook his head vehemently. "No, Papa. She was nice. She told me about a grumpy dragon." His innocent words, so full of genuine warmth, were a stark contrast to the icy tension that permeated the air. The boss nodded, his expression unreadable. He then turned his full attention back to Marcus, and the air around them seemed to thicken, to crackle with an unspoken threat. "You accused this woman of bothering my son. You harassed them. You attempted to physically intimidate her." His voice was still calm, but it held the chilling certainty of a death sentence. "And you threatened to harm a child. My child." Marcus's face went even paler, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "Mr. Rossi, I swear, I didn't mean any disrespect. It was just a misunderstanding. I assure you." He was practically cowering now, a stark contrast to the arrogant bully he'd been moments before. "Misunderstanding?" The boss's voice was a silken thread, but beneath it, Amelia could hear the lethal edge. "I don't misunderstand, Mr. Davis. I merely observe." He paused, and the silence stretched, tightening around Marcus like a noose. "You are no longer welcome here, and you will never set foot in any establishment affiliated with the Rossi family again. If I ever see you near my son, or near her," he gestured vaguely at Amelia, his eyes briefly flicking to hers, a possessive glint in their depths that sent a shiver down her spine, "you will regret it. Deeply." The finality in his tone was absolute. Marcus, his face a ghastly shade of white, didn't dare argue. He simply nodded, grabbed the arm of the terrified woman beside him, and practically fled, disappearing into the crowd without another word. The victory, though satisfying, felt hollow, overshadowed by the intense, unsettling presence of Luca's father. The boss watched Marcus disappear, then slowly, deliberately, turned back to Amelia. His gaze was still unreadable, but the intensity remained. Luca was now looking up at Amelia with bright, grateful eyes. Amelia felt a blush creep up her neck. She had just been protected by a mafia boss. The thought was absurd, terrifying, and strangely exhilarating all at once. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer now, though still commanding, "for staying with my son, for protecting him." Amelia, still shaken, could only nod, her throat suddenly dry. "Papa, she was so brave," Luca exclaimed, looking from his father to Amelia, his eyes shining. She wasn't scared of him. A small, almost imperceptible smile, a mere twitch of the lips, appeared on the boss's face as he looked at Luca. It was a fleeting glimpse of something warmer, something almost human, that transformed his terrifying features for a moment. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual austere mask. His eyes returned to Amelia, and this time, there was a different kind of curiosity in their depths, a genuine intrigue. "Amelia, is it?" he asked, the name rolling off his tongue with a smooth, almost intimate ease that made her heart flutter. "Yes," she managed, her voice still a little hoarse. He stood there for a moment, simply observing her, and she felt a strange mix of fear and an undeniable magnetic pull. This man, who could inspire such terror with a mere look, had just defended her, a complete stranger, and her small act of kindness towards his son. It was a paradox that twisted her perception of him. If you've ever wished someone strong would step in when no one else would, someone who would face down your tormentors and protect the innocent, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because sometimes the most unexpected heroes emerge from the darkest corners, and their protection can change everything. The boss then did something entirely unexpected. He extended his hand, not towards Luca, but towards Amelia. "Come," he said, his voice a low command, yet laced with an undeniable invitation. "Luca and I were about to get some fresh air. You look like you could use some." Amelia hesitated, her mind reeling. The wedding, the humiliation, Marcus's cruel words, the eviction notice, her sister's medical bills, all of it seemed to recede into a distant hum in the face of this man's intense gaze, an unexpected invitation. She was still terrified of him, of the world he represented, but there was also a raw, unfamiliar sense of safety that his presence inexplicably offered, a quiet strength that had faced down her tormentor and protected her when no one else would. She looked at Luca, who was now holding his father's hand, looking up at her with an innocent, hopeful smile. She looked back at the boss, his hand still extended, waiting. Slowly, hesitantly, Amelia placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and utterly possessive. It was a touch that both frightened and thrilled her, a promise of something forbidden and dangerously exhilarating. He led her out of the main ballroom, Luca skipping happily between them, his small hand still clutched in his father's. As they walked, the noise of the wedding receded, replaced by the cool night air and the distant murmur of the city. Amelia felt a strange lightness, a bizarre sense of relief she hadn't known she was capable of. The shame still lingered, a dull ache, but it was overshadowed by the electrifying presence beside her. They found themselves on a secluded balcony overlooking the city lights, a breathtaking panorama of glittering towers and endless sky. Luca immediately gravitated to the railing, pointing out passing cars with childish wonder. The boss leaned against the railing, his silhouette stark against the luminous backdrop, his gaze still fixed on Amelia. "Tell me, Amelia," he said, his voice a low murmur, "why were you sitting alone?" The directness of his question, the sudden intimacy caught her off guard. She averted her gaze, her cheeks flushing again. I'm a distant relative of the groom. An obligation, really. I don't belong here." The words tumbled out, laced with her usual self-deprecation. He said nothing for a long moment, simply observing her. The silence was heavy, but no longer entirely terrifying. There was a contemplative quality to his stillness. "You have a good heart," he finally said, his voice quiet. Not many would have noticed Luca. Fewer still would have stood up to him. Amelia shrugged, a small, self-conscious gesture. It was just, he looked so lonely. "I know what that feels like." The words were out before she could stop them, a raw, vulnerable admission she rarely shared with anyone. He turned fully towards her, his dark eyes searching hers. "Loneliness is a bitter companion," he observed, a hint of something unreadable, perhaps even a flicker of shared understanding in his tone, especially when surrounded by a crowd. The conversation, so unexpected, felt strangely intimate. She found herself telling him fragments of her story, the struggles, the endless fight to stay afloat, the weight of her sister's illness, the crushing despair of impending homelessness. She didn't know why she was confiding in this man, this dangerous stranger. Perhaps it was the raw, protective power he exuded, or the way he simply listened, his gaze unwavering, without judgment or pity. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He simply absorbed her words, his silence more comforting than any hollow sympathy. As she spoke, she realized something profound. For the first time in a very long time, she felt seen, not as a charity case, not as a failure, but as a person with a story, with struggles, with a quiet strength that even Marcus's cruelty couldn't extinguish. Luca, having grown tired of pointing at cars, came back and tugged on Amelia's dress. "Amelia, tell me another story. About the knight and the dragon." Amelia smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that reached her eyes. "Maybe later, sweetie," she said, gently ruffling his hair. The boss, his gaze still on Amelia, then looked at Luca, a flicker of something close to tenderness in his dark eyes. He ruffled Luca's hair in turn.
"Go play near the fountain, son. I need to speak with Amelia." Luca, surprisingly obedient, trotted off. Once they were alone again, the boss stepped closer, invading her personal space, his scent a subtle mix of expensive cologne and something inherently masculine, primal enveloping her. Her heart began to pound again, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Amelia," he said, his voice dropping to a low, seductive whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "I don't like people disrespecting what's mine." Her breath hitched. "What's yours?" she managed, her voice barely a squeak. He reached out, his hand slowly, deliberately lifting her chin, forcing her to meet his intense gaze.
His touch was firm, possessive, sending a jolt of electricity through her. His thumb brushed lightly against her jawline, a gentle caress that felt anything but gentle in its implication. His eyes, dark as midnight, held hers, and in their depths she saw a dangerous desire, a fierce claim that both terrified and thrilled her to her core. "Yes," he murmured, his voice a possessive growl that vibrated through her. "You protected my son. You showed him kindness when no one else would. You stood up to that scum for him, and for that you have earned my regard." His gaze dropped to her lips, and her own lips parted slightly, anticipating, dreading, craving. "More than that, Amelia. I saw you sitting alone, unnoticed, humiliated, and I felt something I haven't felt in a very long time." He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear, sending goosebumps down her arms. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, electric and dangerous. She sat alone at the wedding, until the Mafia boss whispered, "Dance with me, you're mine tonight." And then his lips were on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss, not a tender exploration. It was demanding, possessive, a raw expression of his untamed desire and his absolute claim. Her mind reeled, a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and an undeniable forbidden thrill. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to pull away, to run from this dangerous man, this impossible situation. But her body, against her will, responded, melting into his embrace, her hands hesitantly coming up to rest on his chest. The kiss deepened, a searing inferno that consumed her. All the humiliation, the loneliness, the despair of her life seemed to vanish, replaced by the intoxicating fire of his touch, the overwhelming power of his presence. She was lost, completely and utterly lost, in the dangerous embrace of a man who was everything she should fear, yet everything she found herself desperately craving. When he finally pulled back, her lips were tingling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. His eyes, still dark and intense, held hers. He didn't release her, his hands still holding her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "From this moment, no one touches you," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vow, sealing her fate with his words. "No one looks at you with disrespect. No one dares to humiliate you. You are under my protection. And Amelia," his gaze dropped to her lips again, a possessive fire in his eyes, "you're mine.